That afternoon, I came home early to prepare a surprise birthday dinner for my husband. By midnight, he came home drunk. I gently said, "Next time, if you're not coming home for dinner, just let me know." I thought he would apologize. But no. Daniel staggered toward me and slapped me straight across the face, then growled, "Do you know how hard it is to make money? If you want a husband who comes home on time, you should marry a primary school teacher." I didn't argue. He continued, "My parents think you're a burden, and to be honest, I agree." I said, "Good, got it." He went into the bedroom, talking in his sleep. "Vanessa, don't worry. Your stupid wife will soon be gone with nothing." That night, I made a plan. But at Sunday dinner, when my father-in-law suddenly stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and asked a question that silenced the entire table, the smile on my husband's face disappeared instantly. But before I tell you the full story, please hit the like button and comment below with the city you're watching from. I'll tell it all, right now. My name is Ariana, 35 years old, and I work in the finance office of a public high school in Philadelphia. My job is just enough to support myself. It can't compare to my husband's salary. I've been married to Daniel for 7 years, after 2 years of dating, during which I believed he was the perfect man. He's the marketing director at Walker Group, the real estate company founded by his father, Leonard Walker. In my husband's family, I've always been the quiet one, never competing, never meddling in their business affairs, and I never imagined that my silence would one day be seen as a burden. That Wednesday night was Daniel's birthday. I left work earlier than usual, stopped by the nearby Walmart, and bought exactly the things he'd loved since we first started dating. Beef, potatoes, and a bottle of red wine he once said was decent for the price. I stood in the kitchen all afternoon, the house quiet, the smell of food filling the air. I thought, at the very least, he'd come home early on his birthday. At 7 p.m., I checked my phone. No message. At 9 p.m., still silence. I called him a few times. No answer. By 11:30 p.m., when the roast beef had gone cold and tough, the front door finally opened. Daniel walked in drunk, his tie crooked, shoes still on, his suit jacket carrying a perfume that wasn't mine. He was unsteady on his feet. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked softly, almost out of habit as a wife, "Where have you been so late?" Daniel frowned, his voice sharp. "Entertaining clients." I took a breath and said one more thing I thought was entirely normal in any marriage. "Next time, if you're not coming home for dinner, just let me know." I didn't even have time to process what happened next. Daniel staggered toward me and slapped me straight across the face. The slap wasn't particularly hard, but it left 5 clear red marks on my cheek, burning and numb. He looked at me with a contempt I'd never seen before, then growled, "Do you have any idea how hard it is to make money? If you want a husband who comes home on time, go marry a school teacher." And then he said the words that ended everything inside me. "My parents think you're a burden, and to be honest, I agree." I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't ask another question. I just looked at him and said slowly, clearly, "Good. Glad to know." Daniel turned and walked into the bedroom, as if he'd just stated an obvious truth that required no further response from me. I stood in the kitchen for a long while, then picked up the tray of roast beef I had spent all afternoon preparing, opened the trash bin, and dumped everything inside. Not out of anger, but because I knew that dinner no longer meant anything. That night, I didn't cry. I washed my face, cleaned the kitchen, and lay down beside a man passed out from alcohol. But in my mind, for the first time in many years of marriage, everything became painfully clear. I understood that slap wasn't about the alcohol, nor was it triggered by one careless comment. It was the result of how he had seen me for a very long time. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark, Daniel started talking in his sleep. At first, it was just disjointed sounds, no coherent sentences, his breath heavy with the stench of alcohol. I was used to him talking in his sleep after drinking, so I didn't turn to look. But then he said a name, clearly, slowly, as if he were reassuring someone on the other end of a line. "Vanessa, don't worry. Your stupid wife will soon be out of the picture with nothing." Just a few words, but enough to freeze my entire body. He kept speaking, his voice softening, no longer the harsh tone from earlier, but the voice of a man making promises, giving reassurance. "At the party this weekend, at my parents' house, everything will end." I stayed still, didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly, just stared into the darkness in front of me. In that moment, I no longer had to ask myself whether I was imagining things, or being too sensitive, or torturing myself with groundless suspicions. I had heard it clearly. Not a vague name, not a dreamlike mumble. A specific name, spoken with intimacy, followed by words of comfort. And I understood perfectly. This was no longer a suspicion. This was the truth. A truth that had existed long enough for him to say another woman's name so naturally, even while sleeping beside his wife. I didn't turn to look at Daniel. I didn't need to confirm anything through his expression or his eyes. I just lay there, letting each piece in my mind shift and realign, like numbers on a misbalanced spreadsheet I was reconciling. When the numbers don't match, the problem isn't about emotions, it's about data. And that name, Vanessa, was the first clear piece of data that allowed me to begin evaluating this entire marriage, with reason, not hope. The next morning, I got up early as usual, got ready for work, made coffee, tidied up the house in silence. Daniel woke up late, his head aching from the alcohol, said nothing about the night before, and didn't look me in the eye. I didn't ask. I had moved past the point of needing an explanation. On the way to school, I drove slower than usual, letting my mind go over all the things I had once chosen to ignore. Not because I hadn't seen them, but because I believed marriage required patience. I remembered those weekend client meetings of Daniel's, the appointments he claimed he couldn't skip because the partners were important, the project's big, the relationships long-standing. There were Saturdays when he left home early, saying he'd be back the same day, only to send a short message late at night saying he'd be staying at a downtown hotel for convenience. I believed him. I remembered the high-end restaurant bills that occasionally appeared on the credit card statements, familiar names of places I had only ever seen in magazines, where one dinner could equal a week's worth of a regular family's expenses. I used to tell myself those were business costs, that his world was different from mine. And then there were the unexplained cash withdrawals, not large enough to raise immediate concern, but regular enough that when lined up, they formed a pattern. I had seen them. I had considered asking, but every time, I told myself I wasn't my husband's accountant, that I shouldn't turn our marriage into an audit. Now, with the name Vanessa spoken into the darkness, all those signs were no longer scattered. They stood together now, forming a complete picture, clear beyond denial. I knew the next step wasn't to ask Daniel, but to ask the one person in this family whose word carried real weight. At lunch break, I sat alone in my car, parked in the back lot of the school, where no students passed and no one knew me. I picked up my phone, stared at Leonard Walker's name in my contacts, and it took me a few seconds to press call. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that once this question was asked, there would be no going back. Leonard picked up quickly, his voice deep and composed as always, asking what was going on. I didn't beat around the bush, and I didn't explain at length. I asked directly, with a calm, even voice, the way I always speak when I need a precise answer. "Have you ever thought of me as a burden?" On the other end, Leonard went silent. Not the polite kind of silence, but a distinct pause, as if he had just heard a question he was not prepared for. He didn't answer right away. I heard him take a deep breath. Then, he asked me slowly why I was asking that. I didn't go into detail about the slap. I didn't mention the drinking or the birthday night. I simply told him that Daniel had said it to me, and I needed to know whether it came from the family or not. Leonard sighed, and in that moment, I understood the answer wouldn't be a simple no. He didn't use the word burden, but he admitted indirectly that he had once thought I hadn't fully realized my potential, that I was standing outside a very important part of the Walker Group. Then he said something that made me grip the steering wheel tighter. He had once wanted me to join the family company, not in an assistant role or symbolic position, but as chief financial officer. Leonard said he had brought it up multiple times, but each time Daniel told him I wasn't interested, that I wanted to keep a stable job at the school, that I had declined the offer 3 times. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish. Let each detail reveal itself like an unbalanced report waiting to be reconciled. When Leonard stopped speaking, I replied very briefly, without raising my voice, without emotion. I was never asked. On the other end, another silence. This time longer. I heard the rustle of papers, as if he had just sat up straighter. Leonard asked if I was sure. I said that with my personality, if I had ever been offered such a position, I would not have forgotten, whether I accepted or declined. I added that Daniel had never mentioned it, not even once, and that I was calling not to place blame, but to verify the truth. Leonard didn't deny it. He only said he needed time to check a few things, and before hanging up, he said one short, clear sentence. "Thank you for being direct." When the call ended, I sat still in the car for several more minutes, without starting the engine or opening the door. I knew that from this moment on, the story had moved beyond the boundaries of a fractured marriage. It had touched on dignity, power, and the truth within the very family that Daniel always believed would protect him unconditionally. My father-in-law didn't call me back that afternoon, nor did he ask for any more details about Daniel. And it was precisely that silence that made me realize he was working in his own way. Leonard Walker had never been a man of impulsive action. He built Walker Group from the ground up, lived his whole life based on data, evidence, and emotionless decisions. That evening, Daniel came home late as usual, but his demeanor was strangely normal. No defensiveness, no tension, not a single probing question or accusation. He walked in, hung up his coat, poured himself a glass of water, and asked if I'd had dinner, in that same indifferent tone he always used. If Leonard had confronted him, even briefly, Daniel wouldn't have been able to maintain that composure. I had lived with him long enough to know, whenever he was questioned or forced to face the truth, he always showed anger in his tone or a subtle restlessness at the corner of his eye. But not that night. Daniel acted as though nothing was happening behind his back, as though his position, reputation, and his family's support were all still intact. That very calmness told me one thing with absolute clarity. Leonard had not yet questioned his son. And if he had chosen not to, it wasn't because he was avoiding the truth. It was because he knew Daniel's answers, at this point, would only be carefully edited versions. 2 days later, Leonard called me back. No small talk, no detours. He stated plainly that he had hired 2 independent private investigation firms, completely unconnected to each other, working in parallel. One firm was tracking Daniel's personal life, schedule, and relationships outside of work. The other focused on financial flows, invoices, transactions, any expenses disguised as business-related. Leonard explained very succinctly that he didn't need a convincing story. He needed results that could be cross-verified, so that if 2 separate sources pointed to the same conclusion, it would no longer be a suspicion. He also made it clear that Daniel had no idea about the investigation. No one at the company knew. Not a single assistant, not a single department head had been informed. Everything was being done quietly, legally, and at a distance wide enough for Daniel not to sense any shift in his daily routine. I listened to Leonard, and I felt no satisfaction, no vindication. Only a cold familiarity, like when an internal audit begins. No personal feelings, only the right questions and the right methodology. Before ending the call, Leonard told me one thing I remember clearly, because it was both reassurance and a boundary. I need the truth, not excuses. He didn't promise to protect me. He didn't promise to punish his son. He only promised that he would know exactly what was going on. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, feeling one thing with piercing clarity. I was no longer standing alone in the dark. But at the same time, I no longer had control over this story through my emotions. From now on, the truth would take its own path, slow, precise, and merciless to anyone in its way. 3 days later, Leonard called me during lunch break. His voice hadn't changed, neither louder nor softer, just a clarity in every word that was unmistakable. He said that both private investigation firms, working completely independently, had reached the same conclusion. Daniel was having an affair with Vanessa. Not speculation, not rumor, but a repeated, systematic pattern of behavior, sustained long enough that it could no longer be called a temporary lapse. Leonard didn't read out any salacious details. He spoke only of data, of time markers that overlapped in disturbingly precise ways. Daniel's client meetings, sudden work sessions, the weekends he claimed he had to travel for business. All of it aligned perfectly with Vanessa's travel schedule. Their names appeared together in the same areas, again and again, following a rhythm that only those familiar with deception could maintain for so long. Then Leonard spoke of the invoices. Not just one or two isolated expenses, but an entire system of spending wrapped in a veneer of legitimacy. Upscale restaurants downtown, boutique hotels near commercial districts, places discreet enough not to attract attention, yet luxurious enough to make those involved feel secure. The bills were charged to the company card, labeled as client meetings, conferences, partner visits. And in those receipts, both firms confirmed the same detail. The person accompanying Daniel was never a business partner. Leonard said they had images, timestamps, staff confirmations, even the smallest details that, taken alone, would be easy to miss. But when lined up, they formed a straight line that couldn't be bent. As I listened, every sign I had previously ignored suddenly became painfully clear. The late nights, the absent weekends, the expenses I once reassured myself were just business. There was no feeling of collapse, only a cold confirmation that my intuition, start to finish, had never been wrong. When Leonard ended the call, he said this was only the preliminary result, that he had yet to draw any conclusions or make any decisions, and that he needed more time to complete the full picture. I hung up and sat quietly in the living room, no lights on, staring out at the darkness beyond the window. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief. I simply felt I was standing at the unmistakable threshold between two phases of life, before everything was called by its true name, and after the truth had enough evidence to be undeniable. And I knew, from that moment on, the question would no longer be whether Daniel had betrayed me, but what he would lose once the truth was placed exactly where it belonged. At 1:30 that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a new email from Leonard. No flowery subject line, no polite greeting, just a stream of information, neatly written, precise, exactly the way a seasoned businessman communicates when it's time to deliver the truth. Leonard wrote that Vanessa was currently the Chief Financial Officer, CFO, of Walker Group, appointed 8 months ago, shortly after the former CFO abruptly resigned. Prior to that, for 4 years, Vanessa had worked in the company as head of finance, directly managing accounting teams and budget reports. Leonard admitted that, at this point, he had begun to suspect that Daniel played a role in pushing the former CFO out in such an unusual way. According to the investigators, Daniel's affair with Vanessa had begun 6 months before her official appointment as CFO, meaning the relationship wasn't the result of her power, but quite possibly the driving force behind the company's most critical personnel decision. This wasn't a supporting role, not an honorary title. It was the position that controlled the entire financial bloodstream of the company. Leonard explained that Vanessa directly managed the marketing budget, oversaw cash flow for major projects, and had access to high-level company accounts very few within the company were allowed to touch. I read each line, and in my mind, a structure began to form with frightening clarity. Daniel was the marketing director. Vanessa held the purse strings. Those two positions, when paired, formed a perfect duo, if the goal was to make personal spending look like legitimate business expenses. Leonard continued, stating that it was Daniel who had vouched for and proposed Vanessa's promotion from the start. He was the one who presented her profile, guaranteed her capability, and convinced the board that Vanessa was the most suitable choice for CFO. When I read that, I wasn't surprised. I only felt that everything was now terrifyingly logical. One person proposing, one approving, and a spending system sophisticated enough to remain unnoticed for a long time. That also explained why the expenses I used to see on our statements always seemed legitimate, why no red flags had been raised, and why Daniel had always been so confident in believing he was safe. Leonard ended the email with one short sentence. This partnership had allowed Daniel to hide personal expenses under the guise of company costs all this time. I closed my phone, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since that birthday night, I felt a distinct emotion rise. Not pain, but complete clarity. I no longer saw Vanessa as a woman who appeared in my marriage. I saw her as a critical link in a structure of power and gain that Daniel had deliberately built. And once the relationship between Daniel and Vanessa had been placed in its proper context within the overall picture, Leonard didn't stop at the personal matter. He expanded the scope of investigation to what he knew best: money. Leonard told me he had ordered a full review of all marketing reports from the past 4 years, not to find a single violation, but to identify a pattern. He wasn't looking for big numbers, because big numbers are always easy to spot. He was searching for expenditures just reasonable enough to avoid suspicion, yet regular enough that, when lined up, they began to tell a different story. The results, Leonard admitted, went further than even he had anticipated. In the past 8 months, exactly the period since Vanessa's appointment as CFO, marketing expenses had risen abnormally. Not in a sudden spike, but gradually, distributed across multiple categories: client entertainment, seminars, market research, strategic partner meetings. Each item alone could be explained, but when combined, they amounted to a total far exceeding the actual growth of any marketing campaigns. Leonard said this was the kind of discrepancy only someone used to handling large budgets would recognize, because it didn't shock the system, but it broke its internal logic. He also pointed out a crucial fact. Before Vanessa became CFO, those reports showed no such anomalies. Everything began to skew, subtly, skillfully, after Daniel had someone in finance who both understood the system and was willing to sign off. For Leonard, this was no longer a question of personal ethics. It was the exploitation of a company's structure for private gain. And once that was confirmed, the story no longer belonged within the boundaries of family. While Leonard quietly peeled back each layer of the financial records, my daily life with Daniel continued as if nothing had happened. I still went to work on time, still prepared dinner, still exchanged the necessary pleasantries. I didn't pry, didn't initiate conversation, didn't reveal the slightest hint that I was standing in the middle of an investigation that could bring down his entire world. My silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. I understood very clearly that, at this stage, any reaction would only serve to make Daniel more cautious. And just as I expected, Daniel remained absurdly confident, almost contemptuous. He spoke to me in a patronizing tone, frequently bringing up his work as though it were the sole measure of human worth. He no longer placed his phone face down on the table, made calls in front of me without trying to hide. At times, he looked at me with the gaze of someone who believed he had the entire game in his hands. I observed it all, recorded it in my mind. Not to hurt myself further, but to confirm something vital. Daniel had absolutely no idea that his every move was already under someone else's control. That very sense of overconfidence was what had once made him dangerous to me, and it was also what would leave him defenseless when the truth finally surfaced. I didn't need to win every small conversation. I just had to wait for the right moment, when the truth would be laid bare by the one person he trusted the most, and at that point, every excuse would be meaningless. Leonard called me on Friday afternoon. his voice deeper and more resolute than in previous calls. He said he wouldn't confront Daniel privately, not because he lacked the opportunity, but because he understood his son far too well. A private conversation would only give Daniel time to revise his story, prepare excuses, and worse, find someone else to blame. Leonard didn't want to hear a polished version. He wanted the truth exposed in a place where Daniel couldn't avoid it, couldn't manipulate it, and couldn't retreat into silence. Leonard said he had chosen Sunday family dinner, not a boardroom meeting, not an office discussion, but the familiar dining table in the house where Daniel had grown up. There would be his parents, close relatives, and me, present in my rightful role as legal wife. Leonard understood that in that space, Daniel couldn't walk out without exposing his cowardice, nor could he lie blatantly without risking his reputation in front of his own family. For Leonard, this wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. He wanted his son to face the truth in the very place that had first taught him about honor and consequences. When I hung up, I didn't ask Leonard what he planned to say. I didn't request to see any of the evidence in advance. I understood that my role in that dinner was not to accuse. I only needed to be present. And it was that calm, steady presence, after everything that had happened, that would be the one thing Daniel couldn't prepare for. While Leonard quietly orchestrated a moment that Daniel had no inkling of, on the other side, my husband was becoming dangerously complacent. Daniel believed I had accepted my place in this family. He spoke to me with the tone of someone bestowing favors, no longer even bothering to mask his contempt. Once, half joking, half serious, he told me that if I found this life too exhausting, I could always go back to my stable and safe job. He spoke as if I owed him a position, not as if we had built this marriage together. More importantly, Daniel fully believed that his family would stand by him. He was used to being protected, used to seeing mistakes handled privately, and used to having reputation placed above truth. He didn't realize that this very belief was blinding him. Daniel had no idea that Leonard's silence wasn't an act of dismissal. It was one of observation. He also didn't know that every time he showed confidence, every time he belittled me, he was confirming that he had absolutely no contingency plan for what was coming. On the Saturday night before the family dinner, Daniel told me we'd be having dinner at his parents' house on Sunday. As usual, his tone relaxed, even slightly smug. I nodded, said nothing, asked nothing. But inside, I knew very clearly. He would walk into that dinner believing he was in control, when in reality, every exit had already been quietly sealed. And then Sunday came. Quietly, like any other Sunday. So much so that if one didn't already know, they might think it was just another regular family dinner. My in-laws' house looked the same. The long wooden dining table in the center of the room, warm yellow light spilling over the familiar porcelain plates. Daniel walked in with a relaxed, confident air, like a man absolutely certain that everything was still under his control. He spoke more than usual, laughed loudly, eagerly shared about his work and the promising projects he was handling, almost as if subconsciously building a wall of reputation around himself. The first few minutes of the meal passed in polite silence. I sat in my usual seat, didn't interrupt, didn't stand out. And then, just as everyone was settling in, assuming the evening would end like every other, Daniel put down his knife and fork, stood up, and cleared his throat. No one had asked him to speak. He rose on his own, with the bearing of someone about to announce something important. His voice rang out clearly, enough for the entire table to pause and listen. He began speaking about marriage, but not in a sorrowful or regretful tone. It was the voice of someone analyzing a problem. He said that some relationships, while once right, over time no longer aligned with each individual's path for growth. He didn't mention my name, but every word was directed at me. Daniel spoke of differences in ambition, about how one person might seek greater advancement, while the other preferred stability. He talked as though my choices were an objective obstacle, a factor slowing him down, not a valid and deliberate life decision. I sat there, listening to each word, realizing this wasn't a confession. It was a carefully crafted speech, vague enough not to offend, yet clear enough for everyone to understand the message he was delivering. No one interrupted. The atmosphere at the table shifted slightly, like a familiar melody falling off beat, something only the perceptive would notice. Daniel ended with a summarizing sentence, saying that sometimes acknowledging a marriage no longer works is necessary for both parties. He didn't say the words divorce, but everyone present knew exactly what he was announcing. It was a veiled declaration of divorce, wrapped in the language of logic and ambition, delivered at the family dinner table, where he believed he would receive absolute sympathy and support. Just as the room began to settle after Daniel's speech, Leonard slowly set his napkin aside. He didn't look at me first, nor did he glance around the table. He stood up with measured calm, prompting every eye to turn toward him. There was no anger in his gesture, just a composure that suddenly made the room feel smaller. He called his son's name, not loudly, not with emphasis, but clearly enough that no one could pretend not to hear. Then Leonard asked directly, without any lead-in or pleasantries, "Would you like to explain these hotel and restaurant receipts related to Vanessa?" In that moment, I saw Daniel falter. Not with the surprise of someone wrongly accused, but with the reflex of someone who had just realized the stage he stood on had shifted hands. Leonard didn't wait for an answer. He reached beside his chair, picked up a thick folder, and laid it on the dining table among the half-eaten plates. The paper hit the wood with a dull, dry thud, small but loud enough to sever every lingering thought in the minds around the table. Leonard stated that this was the result of two independent private investigation firms, working in parallel, cross-referencing data, unrelated to one another, leaving no room for error or excuses. The whole table froze. I could feel the atmosphere shift drastically, as if the room had just been drained of oxygen. Daniel's face drained of color in an instant. It happened so quickly that even when he tried to smile, the muscles in his face no longer obeyed. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it again, his eyes darting around the table, looking for a familiar refuge. But no one spoke up. Not a word in his defense. No attempt to change the subject. Only the heavy silence of those who had just realized the story had entered a phase from which there was no return. From the moment Leonard placed the file on the table, everyone knew that any words Daniel might say next would have to contend with evidence, not reputation, not family status. Leonard didn't wait for Daniel to finish a single sentence. He didn't ask further questions, didn't argue, didn't let the dinner descend into a family dispute. He simply said that everything necessary was now clear enough to move into the next phase. That very evening, Leonard delivered his first decision with a tone as calm as it was cold. Vanessa was immediately suspended from her position, and all her access to Walker Group's financial systems was revoked. No lengthy emails, no emergency meetings, just a precise administrative action executed by someone with full authority. In the following days, an internal audit was launched. Leonard didn't disclose the results publicly, but he told the family that the data was enough to confirm one thing. Vanessa had directly participated in embezzling company funds, not as someone manipulated, but as an active link in the chain of personal financial concealment. The money didn't show up as a dramatic shock, but was scattered, wrapped within legitimate-looking expense categories, properly documented, properly signed, yet misused. For Leonard, that was a boundary that could not be ignored. Leonard summoned Vanessa for a private meeting. Daniel was not present. There was no arguing, no tears. He laid out two options, clear, like two lines in a contract. 1. Return the full amount taken, sign a confidentiality agreement, and leave Walker Group quietly, with no public statement. 2. Walker Group would forward the entire file to authorities and let the matter proceed through criminal prosecution. Leonard didn't issue threats. He simply stated that the company was prepared for either path. Vanessa chose the first option. Within 10 days, the money was returned in full, per the agreement. There was no farewell event, no internal memo. She disappeared from Walker Group so swiftly that anyone not checking the HR system might think she had never been there. And at the same time, Leonard delivered his final decision regarding his son. Daniel was suspended from his position, all authorities temporarily revoked, no longer holding any role to command or represent the company. But his greatest loss wasn't written on paper. It was the withdrawal of his family's support, something he had believed was permanent. No one defended him. No one pleaded for leniency. In that silence, Daniel understood clearly. This time, he wasn't being punished for a personal mistake. He was being held accountable for having lost the trust of those who had protected him the most. After everything that had happened, I didn't need more time to decide. A few days after that dinner, I filed for divorce, quietly. No dramatic announcements, no public declarations. Daniel called me, his voice lower now, saying he was ready to change, that his mother thought I should give him another chance, that the family could overcome this if I would just be willing to compromise. I listened without interrupting. But when he finished, I simply replied that my decision had nothing to do with whether he had a chance. It had to do with the fact that I no longer had a reason to stay. Under Pennsylvania law, marital assets are divided equitably, not to punish or reward either party, but to conclude a relationship that no longer has a foundation. I didn't fight, didn't demand more than what was mine. I only wanted a clean end, clean enough that I'd never have to revisit it or explain anything again in the future. When the papers were signed, I felt a strange relief, not because I had won, but because I no longer had to prove my worth to anyone. One morning, I received an email from Leonard. It was short. No defense of his son, no explanations for past choices, just a direct apology, written like a man who understands that some mistakes cannot be repaired with reasons. I read it several times, then replied with a single sentence. "Thank you for giving me the truth." That was when I believed my connection to the Walker family had ended. But exactly 1 month after receiving that email from my former father-in-law, on an otherwise ordinary morning, I stood in the bathroom and watched 2 lines appear on a pregnancy test. No soundtrack, no dramatic moment. I just stood still for a long time, hand resting on my belly, and realized that life always finds a way to open a new door, just when you think you've closed the last one. The first thing I did wasn't call Daniel. I didn't even think of it. The only person I called, after sitting down and breathing deeply until my voice no longer trembled, was Leonard. When he picked up, I didn't beat around the bush. I told him I had just learned I was pregnant, that this child was not a tool to salvage any relationship, and that I would take full responsibility for my child's life. Then I said something that made Leonard fall silent for a long time. I wanted him to know because he was still the child's grandfather, and if my baby was born healthy, I would give the child his family name as a way to honor truth and dignity. But I also set a very clear boundary. I asked Leonard not to tell Daniel. Not out of hatred, but because I didn't want my child's life to begin with chaos or belated calculations. Leonard didn't answer immediately. Then I heard his voice change, with a kind of emotion I had never heard before. He said it was the best news he'd received in months, that he respected my decision, and that he would keep that promise as his responsibility. He didn't ask me what I needed. He didn't try to intervene. He just said that from this moment on, he would no longer dwell on what was lost, but on what right still remained. A few weeks later, Leonard sent me a set of legal documents, not a gift, not an empty promise. It was a family trust, legally established, in which 55% of his assets would be set aside for the child, to be inherited upon reaching adulthood, with clear protective terms. Leonard wrote that he wasn't doing this to make amends for his son, but to ensure that his legacy followed truth, responsibility, and the right choice. I finished reading, closed the folder, and for the first time in a very long time, I smiled, without fear. I don't know where the future will take me and my child, but I know this much. Family is not defined solely by marriage or blood, but by those who choose to stand by what's right when they could have chosen what's easy. And from that moment, I knew that my story didn't end with a divorce. It began with a legacy, quiet, steadfast, and strong enough to shelter the new life growing inside me. If this story touched you, even just a little, please like to support me and subscribe so you won't miss the stories to come. The stories of women who were once overlooked, but who've learned to stand tall on their own worth. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. Maybe that will be the moment they realize they're not alone.